Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined once again today by Joshua Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. How are you this morning, Dr. Blank, other than having to wait for me?
Well, hey, I'm...
You don't answer that.
Boss.
Please, podcast listeners,
No,
Dr. Blank does not have an answer to that question.
No, boss, all good.
Mark the calendar.
Anyways, doing great.
Yeah, here we are. So I was out giving a presentation for the Lumbermen's Association of Texas. Thanks to them for having me out, but it led to a schedule change that I probably did not communicate clearly about. But here we are, about a half hour later, recording than our usual time on Thursday here at the University of Texas at Austin. We were hoping to have, and I think we promised, so we've bait and switched already.
Oh.
We're hoping to have our colleague Darren Shaw join us to talk about our latest polling work this week, but we're having scheduling conflicts. We've all got teaching schedules this term.
You were talking to Big Wood?
Getting everything to, well, it's more retail.
Little Wood?
Although I like the Big Wood.
I
like where you're going with that, I guess. Anyway, we'll leave that there.
We'll get to housing costs
Speaking
in a
of trying to get sued or fired. So we are going to focus again today on some of the results from the latest UT Texas Politics Project poll, which we conducted at the end of August in the field, August 22nd to September 1st. Last week we talked a lot about public opinion in the raucous legislative session, and that was, as one would expect, I think, the focus of the poll, or one of the main focuses of the poll. But there was a lot of other stuff on here, and I thought that, this week we can operate on maybe a different, not just a different focus, but a kind of a different level of analysis and go a little more macro and a little more national, which is what we usually do with Darren. So we want to hit on kind of what the poll told us a little about the national macro environment, maybe start with views of Donald Trump, where he is particular on the issues, some interesting developments in his strengths and weaknesses, which inevitably leads us to touch on the economy and what we found out about Texans' focus on the economy, both writ large and a little more specifically, and some of that's pretty interesting. A lot of it's pretty interesting, actually.
Yeah, well, I think, part of you're saying, like the poll was, largely focused, on the special session, and you're kind of like, and I'm like, but, part of it is the challenge in some ways at this moment is, and we've been talking about this a lot here, is sort of where exactly the dividing line or intersection exactly is between national and state right now is a real big challenge. And I find myself...
there's a lot of bleed through.
Yeah, I've been finding myself having to, sort of navigate this with a lot of kind of questions that I'm getting about sort of, state level responses to seemingly kind of national stories and sort of what that's looking like. And so you're seeing just a lot more of that, and it's hard not to say, as a quick thing, we'll kind of come back around to this, actually, this maybe is a good transition, is, Donald Trump puts on the song and everybody else has to dance.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that going on here, and you can see that because of, and setting aside whether that's good or bad or whatever. I mean, look, he's commanding the political space in a way that, it's hard not to find another Republican elected official operating within whatever those currents are.
Yeah, and there's a lot of velocity there. I mean, it's not, it's kind of not the same needle drop every time by a long shot. So
a lot of remixes.
So, so we'll talk about that, and that'll, all of that will kind of lead us to the 2026 election, and especially with, I think of as the proto stages of the U.S. Senate race in Texas. Now, that doesn't mean to say there's nothing going on, but we'll get to that and talk about some of our thoughts on that. So, why don't you start us off? Where was Donald Trump when we, in the questions we asked about him? We asked a lot of things, and kind of give us the layout on that.
Yeah, I mean, let's start at the top, right? So, I mean, overall, we always ask job approval items, and so for Donald Trump, we saw 43% of Texans approving 50% disapproving, which is, not a great number in I would say more than a nominally Republican state. Now, 93% of Democrats disapproved, 85% of Republicans approved. But what we're really looking at, and as he's kind of said, I'm thinking about and tracking, is sort of some of the key groups when we're thinking about moving ahead into the election space as time goes on. So where were independents? Where were moderates? Where were Hispanic voters? And the reality was they're all kind of in the same place. If we looked at independents, 18 approve, 60 disapprove. Moderates, 24 approve, 60 disapprove.
And the same place they've been, you mean kind of?
Well, I mean the same place together. I was just saying across, Hispanics, 30% approve, 63% disapprove. So it's about this 30-60 split across most of the groups that we think of as being, sort of in the competitive space. Same thing with suburban voters. We'll get into the trends in a little bit. But in general, I would say these are not great numbers, for the president. We can kind of look back and we can say, October of 2020, so we say right on the eve of losing election but winning the state of Texas, his job approval was 49.46, so he was +3. He entered office at 52.38, so +14, which is, we expect presidents to come in with a certain amount of good feeling, excitement.
Especially in the last election where there was, clearly a dissatisfaction with the status quo and the incumbent.
Absolutely, with the incumbent's party and whatever. By April, had almost run even to 47.46. Now in the last two polls, he's been at about -7 net. So he was 44.51 in June, 43.50 in August. So I would see that like right now, we'll see if that's sort of settling into something. But what's notable in a lot of this is, what we're looking at is the trends here. Now some of this I think we just have to acknowledge. Like, look, anybody who is holding an executive office is going to generate more attention, is going to generate more negativity from the opposition party. Just attention, it's just inevitable. But nonetheless, we are looking at these subgroups, and that's why I'm not necessarily as focused on Republicans and Democrats. Look, we know Republicans are largely happy, and I'll point out the one area that they're a little bit not, and that's on the economy. We'll come back to that. We know Democrats are unified in their opposition to Trump, so we look at these other groups. And again, looking at net favorability, independents who usually don't like anybody, so let's just start with that as a starting point. They were -16 in terms of their net job approval for Trump in February, so it was 32 approve, 48 disapprove. That went to -19 in April, -33 in June, and it is now -42 net approval going over time. We look at suburban voters, same thing. It was net was +10 in February, and he enters office, goes to -2 in April, -14 in June, and is now -20. And the interesting thing, actually, given sort of the way we think about the political geography in the state, his job approval numbers right now in suburban parts of the state look about the same as they look in urban parts of the state, which is pretty unusual. Usually we would expect the suburban parts of the state to sort of skew a little bit more towards the overwhelmingly Republican rural parts, and now they look a little bit the same. Now, I think there's two things going on there right now. One is an erosion of support a little bit in the suburban areas, but the other is the fact that, the response to Donald Trump in the urban areas has not been uniformly negative. It's been net negative, but it hasn't been overwhelming in some sort of sense that these are, I'll say, if you listen to the political rhetoric in the state, you would think that the urban centers are these all of them are these overwhelmingly Democratic liberal enclaves, and that's just
every Republican is left because it's so terrible there, but it's not the case.
It's just not the case, and so I think that's part of what you're seeing there. Is that a little bit of that is the fact that the urban areas are not as Democratic as maybe they have been historically. At the same time, the rural areas are a little bit skewed against the incumbent here. I think that's fair to say. We also did favorability numbers, and we like that because, we don't have the interruption of not being in office, so we can kind of look at a longer time horizon to sort of see how Trump is doing there. Similar numbers, of course, because they will be similar, 42 favorable, 50 unfavorable. But I think, what I was looking at here again is, again, overwhelming Republican favorable attitudes, overwhelming negative Democratic attitudes. But again, we look at independents. Net favorability was -22 in February when he entered office. It's -47 today. Among Hispanics, who's a group that have been...
I was hoping you were going to get to this. This is one of the most interesting things, really, in terms of the trend here.
Yeah, let's sit on this for a second. So with Hispanics, and whether we're looking at job approval or we're looking at favorability numbers, we see a huge erosion relative to the election. And this was a big part of the election, was that, leading in, Donald Trump was polling a lot better with Hispanics, we'll say, than Republican candidates. I think in one of our, near the end of the election poll, he was almost running even with Hispanics. And honestly, it's that kind of observation in those numbers that's really pushed a lot of the redistricting focus, at least in South Texas, not maybe in the urban areas, but this idea that Republicans have developed an advantage with this group However, when we look at these numbers, let's do job approval just because why not? They're very similar. It doesn't really matter which one we look at. But if we look at February of this year, he was 44.46 approved, disapproved, so -2 among Hispanics. In April, he was 41.52, -11. In June, 38.57, -19. And in August, it's 30.63, -33. And that tracks pretty well to favorability numbers. But we're getting to the territory now where there's about 2/3 of Hispanic voters who are not pleased with the direction.
I mean, in
things.
retrospect, when you look at that, when you look at those numbers on, and I think we have a trend by Hispanics on the website. I think we used it fairly recently for a podcast. But nonetheless, when you look at that trend, it's really crystal clear that, to the president's advantage, to Republicans' advantage, he peaked among Latinos apparently at just the right time.
Yeah,
because that October 2024 is the high point in the time series.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is a good transition to the issues piece of this. And part of this is, the story that, I think you and I largely agreed to from looking at the polling was, when we looked at the election polling and we looked at where Trump's real advantages, lay in that cycle, it was around the economy. And when we asked people what they cared about, Hispanics in particular were expressing concerns about the economy and had more trust in Trump to handle it. And when we look at the issue-specific job approval numbers for Trump, they're not great by any stretch. And just to say, I think we, probably test, I haven't counted, but probably about 16 issues here. He's only above water on one over in the whole electorate. And again, this is just to say the sample has more Democrats than Republicans. Like, this is not, a function of the sample. He's only above water on border security, where he's +6 with 48 approve and 42 disapprove. He's underwater or at best even on everything else. The best two other issues are immigration, 45-46, approve, disapprove, and crime, public safety, 44-44. But notably, he's underwater by 26 points on inflation and prices. 56% of Texans disapprove of the job he's doing there, 30% approve. 52% disapprove of the job he's doing on the economy, only 15% approve. And I think, probably related to, I don't know, but potentially related to the congressional budget, he's -22 on healthcare, which kind of came, I think, out of nowhere a little bit. 49% disapprove, so almost a majority, only 27% approve. Problematic for the president. These numbers are worse among Hispanics. They're worse among, obviously, independent and suburban voters. But what I would be worried about if I were sitting here as a Republican consultant right now, among Republicans, approval on inflation and prices, 61-20. So 1 in 5 Republicans right now disapproves of the job that he's doing on inflation and prices. And that's like a big red flag. Because if you don't have that base of because we've talked about this, the economy is the most important issue for most voters most of the time because it touches everything. You can't have 1 in 5 of your base saying, I don't know.
Well, and I think, the interesting thing about, the economy being most important for most people most of the time, another thing that we've been tracking is the relative decline in the salience of immigration and border security as, problems facing both the nation and the state,
right?
Over time and a real, undeniable decline in the salience of the issue as things have quieted down at the border and the focus of the issue has moved more from border security to immigration in a lot of ways, and immigration enforcement, and look, just in some, I don't want to say objective, but in some visible, physical way, the border is just a less evident, it's just clearly less of a problem right now. It's less of a policy problem given the slowdown in traffic. And that's, as we've said on here a million times, that started really before the president took office. And this decline was beginning to become evident in that period.
Yeah.
But it's very sharp now if you look at the data.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the challenge is, I think that, it's interesting because, we ask for the most important problem facing the state and the country all the time. And I don't want to say it's like a boring result, but it has been kind of boring for a number of years because of its consistency.
It was boring until it wasn't.
Yeah, it was boring until it was. That's why, And there's a little thing with thinking the best, when people say like, oh, what's the best public opinion question? And it's like the one that I didn't start asking 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Those are the best questions. But this is something we have been asking for a long time. And it is really interesting because on the one hand, you had the issue of immigration border security that was just so unifying for Republicans. And it was something that could be talked about almost all the time. And that if you bring it up, and we know this from our polling, you're speaking to the most important issue of almost 2/3 of Republican voters. Now, with Trump in office having presumably, let's just say, addressed the issue in some meaningful way so that it's no longer on the table, well, then the question was, okay, so what is on the table? And you say, well, it would be the economy. because of what people are telling us about the economy, and for independents, for Democrat, let's say it's for independents and for the least, let's say, less partisan voters on both sides, the economy still is front and center. For Democrats, that focus has shifted solely to political leadership. It's shifted to Trump. It's shifted to Abbott. We kind of talked about that last week. But for everyone else, the economy is still this issue out here. But I think the Republicans have a bit of a challenge because I think with the style of Trump's leadership, with the role that loyalty plays, with the premium and importance that's placed on messaging and pushing back on any sort of news that's seen as critical, even if it's just a fact, it means that Republicans can't speak to these concerns very directly right now.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying Democrats are. I mean, Democrats are doing whatever, but it's also like to the extent that the politics of the moment feels almost kind of just. I don't want to say, I'm not going to sort of just detached from certain moorings, or sort of like, what are we doing next? What are we talking about? So, a lot of people are trying to talk to me right now about the governor going after particular college students on college campuses, which is an interesting thing in the sense of certainly an imbalance in power by a long shot, but it's also something that I think provides, along with some other things, a necessary distraction from what are kind of some real fundamental issues here that voters keep telling us about. Nearly 2/3 of voters say that they're concerned, very concerned, not a little concerned, very concerned about price of everyday goods, which they've been since last year, the price of housing, which they've been since last year. They remain concerned about the price of healthcare. Yeah,
I mean, I'm glad you circled back to healthcare because the healthcare thing is a very interesting thing that's lurking here because there is, there's an interesting disconnect. I mean, there's one disconnect that gets us into these kind of discussions that you were kind of comments you were making about, what one can talk about and one can safely talk about and one can't safely talk about, within the Republican Party, right, among elected officials in particular. The healthcare thing is a little. I was talking to somebody after the conference. I did my bit at the conference this morning who wanted to talk about healthcare and asked a question, wanted to follow up. And I was kind of kicking this around. I mean, we've seen healthcare as an issue in particular contexts really bubbling along for a while. Yeah. It's ranked, we've been asking this question about the different components of the different, issues in terms of economic concern. And healthcare has ranked most of the time. Yeah. I mean, it's moved up a little bit, I think, but not. It's always been at least middle to high middle.
I was going to say it's usually, I think, in the top three in terms of when we talk about, in the general basket of costs, housing, basically groceries, healthcare. It's always been pretty high.
And it doesn't, tickle the MIP, the most important problem batteries, even in those kind of open-endeds that we did in the session. Yeah. But it seems very persistent to me. And I was talking to the gentleman I was talking to after the presentation. And I'm still kind of, getting my head around it. I mean, I think there's a lot of we've been watching it. Yeah. We've talked about it. I mean, I think we've said it on here before that, this is kind of a thing to watch. And, it is coming to a head in some ways. And I've heard this from people in, the business of healthcare that, if they really do decide to cut the subsidies in the budget that's being debated, as we, being adjudicated as we speak, it's going to have a huge impact. And by that, I mean, the point was it was going to affect a large number of people. And I'm wondering, there's already this sensitivity out there. There's a lot of reasons. I mean, healthcare is complicated. Yeah. People encounter it in their lives, I think, in a way that they don't encounter it. It's different from how you encounter the prices at the grocery or even housing prices. Because it's not quite as steady other than insurance.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, one, in those scenarios, presumably the market provides you with choices. In a lot of healthcare decisions, the choices are very, very limited. And so it's not as though someone has a choice to say, well, I'm going to rent and not buy, or I'm going to wait another year, I'm going to move to this neighborhood, or I'm going to, substitute a product. There's a little bit of that, but there's not a ton. I think, there's a couple, I mean, to me, what I would say is, I look at sort of the concern is prices overall as being impacted by sort of two pressures. And one is the upward pressure on prices, but the other is the sort of downward pressure somewhat on wage growth. And as the economy locks up in terms of job movement, you're not seeing a lot of people increase their wages. Generally, you're not seeing wages go up very much, and that's been sort of a big piece of this. But because of inflation, the cost of everything else has, which means its relative cost is significantly more for people. And I think, one of the, broader things that we look at, one other point I want to come back to on healthcare, but one of the other things we look at is people's assessment about what they think about sort of like the performance of the economy is going to be in the future.
Yeah.
And I think this is one where, if I were a Republican, this is the one that would worry me the most. The election is a long ways away.
Yeah.
But when I look at this, what I see is, we ask people again, do you think, the economy, the national economy is going to be basically somewhat better off in the future, a lot, I think we said in the next year. So a lot better off, about the same, or a lot worse, or somewhat worse off. Back in December of 24, so Trump had won re-election, he's entering office, people are thinking about the economy. 52 said it was going to be better, 23 said worse. By February, it was still above water, 49 better, 31 worse. By April, 42 better, 35 worse. June, 35 better, 38 worse. And August basically stayed the same, 34, now 40 worse. So it went from, it's gone, the share saying that the economy is going to be better has gone down 18 points since December. And the share saying it's gone worse has gone up 17 points over that time period. And so I think, you sort of throw that in there too, this notion that, I think, just generally when you look at a lot of polling, even beyond ours, the challenges that people are feeling and sort of advancing their lives forward on these big issues are really ever present. And something like a health emergency can really just screw someone. I mean, in a way that all of a sudden, you had a down payment for a house, not anymore, or whatever it might be. And that's not something anybody can avoid. The other pieces that a lot of people pointed out is if the party coalitions are changing, right? And if Republicans are more attractive as a brand to working class voters and to voters of a lower socioeconomic status, you're going to have more voters on government programs. I mean, one of the things I think, I first learned many, many years ago, like in a, public policy course, or whatever, was like, there's sort of the rhetoric around, welfare, the historical rhetoric around welfare, something about Ronald Reagan and welfare queens and the idea that, essentially welfare programs were overpopulated by basically non-white people. Well, the reality is that most people on welfare and welfare type programs are white people because they're the majority of the population. So it's just a mathematical thing. It's not, and a lot of people point out during the budget debate that the congressional district with the highest, number, I think it is, of Medicaid recipients is in Mike Johnson's district.
Yeah, it's in Louisiana.
And this is, and I just say, I don't know if now maybe none of this matters, but I don't know if Republicans have really figured out, what their coalition, Democrats have their own problems, but I think Republicans have coalitional elements and issues here that, are still kind of playing themselves out here, and you can see this in these sort of healthcare concerns.
Yeah, I think kind of where you went with that's interesting is that, there's something experiential about this. Is kind of what I'm trying to get my head around. There's something experiential about people's experience of, the cost of healthcare and dealing with the system, and I think that, some of the systemic difficulties in performance are probably bleeding into these cost assessments. I have to pay more. My insurance doesn't cover, all things being equal.
I don't know what I'm going to pay.
I don't know what I'm going to pay. And it's just a, I think there's a hypothesis here that it's very often a very unpleasant experience in what are probably usually tense, uncomfortable, emotional circumstances already when people have the kind of worst experiences that you hear coming out of the system about how much they have to pay, what's covered, what's not, surprise billing, et cetera, that I think is feels to me to be operative out there somewhere. Yeah, but it's hard to quantify. Well, at least with what we've done.
It is, but I will say, there is a stat out there, and I'm not going to butcher it. I'm going to be close, but you can go look up the exact stat. But there's something you can look this up, but it's sort of, there's a percentage of Americans who can cover an unexpected $400 expense, and there's a percentage of Americans who can cover an unexpected $1,000 expense, and it's not as high as you would think it would be. It's certainly less. It's certainly less than 50% in most cases. And so, if you think about that, there's almost no medical expense of any real kind that could come up that is going to be less than that.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing. And so people are constantly living in a state of, I would say, if not perpetual fear, there's the possibility that an unforeseen medical expense is going to wipe them out. And that is the reality in America for most people. Yeah. So
or even at a less catastrophic level, if it doesn't wipe them out, it's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
So you're going to go through this experience that's, probably a negative experience anyway.
Right.
In terms of just your, having a health problem, or an emergency, or, and then this gets layered on top of it. And there's just not going to be a good association if you go through that even once. But if you got some chronic condition or you have a run of health bad luck, or you got an accident-prone kid or something.
Well, and I mean, it's worth just political time is a wild thing, but I mean, it is worth remembering that during Donald Trump's first term, they could not repeal the Affordable Care Act. They were unable to come up with any sort of plausible political path forward to end these subsidies, to kick people off. And I mean, that was the fear all along for Republicans with the passage of the program. But I think the politics of that were what they were. I don't think that the politics of that have changed as far as the public is concerned. The politics have changed in terms of how power is being exercised and how, people are essentially, what people are and aren't responding to in positions of power. But I don't think the underlying politics that we're seeing in the data and the way that people actually react to the healthcare system has changed in any fundamental way.
And what's negotiable and what's not in terms of a budget package. And,
right.
Because another thing in those in those economic numbers, we want to go back too far, but is that, while, the argument about the public arguments about spending now and, this issue with the Medicaid subsidies now is a fiscal one, and people that are trying to stick with those cuts are talking a lot about, the debt and spending, the deficit. Those are not moving the needle a lot in those economic numbers.
No, I mean
they're not, zero.
No, I mean, look, I think that the change in the administration from a Democratic administration to a Republican administration has, predictably brought a greater focus back to the debt and the deficit. And it's been reflected in the voters. I mean, you can see that in our numbers. The share of voters who are talking about that, especially as the budget negotiations were going on, increased a little bit, and especially among Republicans. So, I mean, it's there. But when you compare it to these sort of more fundamental things, which again, I think one important thing isn't just, where we sit and think about elections, if you're a diehard Democrat or a diehard Republican, none of this stuff is likely to make a difference in terms of 2026 when you go in the voting booth.
Right.
But part of the thing that happens is, big elections draw in less attached people, and they're going to be looking at these sorts of performance-based issues, and that's kind of what is going to push a lot of people.
And performance-based issues in areas that are salient to them.
Exactly.
Right, and that's that's where I think the touch back and connect the dots a little bit more. Something earlier, that's where this matter, like the Latino sort of party identification, but more specifically the Latino judgments of Trump are so interesting. Mm-hmm. Because it's not a matter of Latinos, as I think some people would have you say, or I mean, I look, and I'm not. It sounds more dismissive than I mean it, but there's a common refrain out there. It's like, finally, people are realizing that Latinos are inherently conservative. They should have been Republicans all along. We just weren't tapping into it. We've now tapped into it, and we've turned the tide. What we're seeing is that is not quite right. That it's a matter not of party switching, but of just overall weakened party attachment. And I think Darren was kind of making that point, I think, after the last poll. And I think that's just becoming more apparent. Yeah,
and I mean, just to make a really, really fine distinction what you said, it's not even not weekend, but weak. I mean, it's just weak party attachment. I mean, in some ways, one of the interesting things is if you've been following this discussion about, Latinos in Texas for a long time, one of the big sort of interesting features of it, I would say, from where I'm sitting, this is an observation of my own, I'll just say, is, the weakness and lack of consistency in Democratic efforts to, let's say, shore up or improve their support with that group. Whereas I can look and point to specific efforts that Republicans have made specifically in South Texas to increase, their rates of voting among Hispanic populations down there. I don't really know. I can't say, having, again, looking at this as I do, that I've seen similar efforts among Democrats. And I think, to some extent, that's really a lot of the story here is this is a group that's largely not been spoken to in a lot of these elections in any sort of direct way. So it's not surprising then that, when they are being spoken to more directly, and it's very, it's like, they're not necessarily all Democrats or all Republicans or significantly attached one way or another. They are looking at performance issues. They are saying, I think fairly enough, what have you done for a living lately,
Well, and I would say that, to this week or weekend.
Yeah, sure.
To, push back on your micro-correction. I mean, I think if you go back and look, I mean, it fluctuated within a fairly predictable band for a long time. And part of the, misconception which we beat like a dead horse in here is the idea that that Republican share was always kind of bigger as a baseline than people would, Democrats in particular, would acknowledge.
Yeah.
It's like, we were polling the wrong Latinos, or it's a matter of, voting obstacles. And those are not, polling Latinos is difficult and was particularly difficult early on, et cetera, et cetera. But, that did get a little wilder, for a while there.
Yeah.
Right. And I guess the question is, where does it go back? I mean, when I look at the numbers we're seeing, where the numbers are back, the approval numbers are back down in the kind of high 20s, low 30s.
Yeah. It's kind of where it was.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, kind of where it used to be.
And I guess the question is, having, if we have, to the extent that we buy, and I think it seems reasonably plausible that, some of this was some first-time Latino male voters, or how much will they? How durable will that be?
Right.
It's kind of their party attachment, I think, that is the biggest question. Like young people's party attachment, a lot of the time.
100%. I want to say, we haven't talked about that group in particular. I mean, I said I sort of focus more on independents and suburbanites and Hispanics here. But one of the interesting groups I think we want to keep track of, and I think we need a little bit more data before we do yet, is what's going on.
Cells are small in the individual polls.
Yeah, and I think and there's there's more fluctuation because of the lack of attachment. But, when you're looking at 18 to 29-year-olds, that's going to be an interesting group in this upcoming election, assuming, Democrats get candidates and run and all that stuff. But partially, and I think, one of the things the next thing I'm going to do when I look at that group is I think, you're probably going to see a pretty big difference by gender.
Yeah,
that's where,
that's the other piece of that.
That's where I think, there's a huge gender gap in this poll. And I think it's bigger than I've noticed traditionally, and I think that's probably being driven by the young people. And as much as we're seeing these trends in these different groups, sort of I would say trending slightly negative outside of hardcore partisans, it's a little bit less apparent exactly what's going on in that group. And I think part of that, again, small sample size, but also it is the fact that I think there's the gender gap in there is real and potentially more durable. Than maybe some of this other stuff we're looking at. Yeah, and that's going to be interesting. Okay, so speaking of, you had a transition line there. Did I?
Now I've lost it, but speaking, candidates. Let's talk about the Senate race a little bit before we go, or the Senate pre-race, or however we're going to call it. Maybe
come on, Jim, take a stand.
Telegraph where we're going here. So let's talk about that. So let's start with and we should let's talk about what we did with what we found among Republican candidates. As we're recording this, there's kind of a little boomlet. I think it's a Tribune story, or maybe it's a Politico story that triggered it, that, Wesley Hunt is actually seeming a little more likely to get in the race now. Okay. True, not true. I mean, we definitely, some trial balloons have been launched.
Right.
And been, grabbed at by some, reporters. And I think, one thing I would just say as a side comment on this, there's a real, I think, not particularly helpful trend among reporters to really respond, there's somebody else in a race. Yeah. Because somebody kind of talked about it. Yeah. And had, but that said, Congressman Hunt is clearly sending some signals to media, as the people are reaching out to reporters and seeing
we put him in the poll.
And we had him in the poll, and let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So talk about what we did. Start with what we did, and we'll talk a little bit about how we approach this.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things we
did and what we found.
Yeah, one of the things we've been doing regularly is, part of the poll we always ask about a series of political news stories, just to get a sense of, whether something's like a big story or just like a big story to nerds like us. Honestly. Yeah. And I think that's usually a good public opinion gut check for anybody sometimes is, to ask yourself how much people have heard about, like AMD, or NVIDIA buying Intel or whatever. It's just like, you got to remember most things most people are not paying attention to.
No, I think that's, honestly, I think in terms of our own, kind of thinking about our process, I think we've come to a place, and, starting a few years ago, got a lot better at just checking the salience of some of those issues with that science battery that we run and running things in and out of there to kind of look at what the attention universe is like.
Right. So, so just to give you an example, at the top of the list of stories people heard about was flooding in central Texas in early July. 72% of Texans said they had heard a lot about this, right?
Yeah.
By comparison, asked about the 2026 U.S. Senate race in Texas, 19% said they'd heard a lot about this, which I think, and I should say also, I think all of these numbers are somewhat inflated, just as an aside.
Yeah.
People are more likely to say...
No, I heard a lot.
Yeah, people are more likely to
Yeah.
overinflate their knowledge than to underinflate it on average. And so there's that. So this was near the bottom. I think it was second from the bottom, only next to, domestic computer chip manufacturers sharing some of the revenue from sales to China with the U.S. government, which is interesting. And I think some of you might find it interesting. We'll say that for, another time, another day. That was 13%. But the main thing is we've consistently been asking about this, and this is kind of where it's at this point. Between 16 and 19% of Texans saying that they've heard a lot about the race. Republicans are hearing, I think Democrats are hearing a little, Democrats, sorry. Democrats are paying a little bit more attention than Republicans, I think for kind of the same reason that Democratic candidates might be paying a little bit more attention.
Yeah, sure.
But for the most part, this remains kind of, this remains a race that's going to take place next fall. A year from the fall that's coming up now.
Now, look, just put devil's advocate from people that
go please.
I love and it. I'm this is just to be fair, not because I believe it per se, but they would say, well, look, but the primary is only a few months away, and they would also say, you guys are swinging around that 19% allot number. I think that allot number is 10 in June.
Right
now, so look, we acknowledge that. Yeah. As I'm kind of, bringing out an argument you were kind of implying, which is, is this race, all things being equal, kind of probably generating more media attention than, say, the last one did even, or at this point, people, it's drawing, there's a little more action.
Yeah, and look,
but 19 is 19.
And I'm not, well, look, and here's the thing, and I'm not dismissing its importance, and I'm not dismissing the fact that people can have attitudes about things that they're not thinking about. I think the question for us comes down as being, I think trying to be serious about our jobs and what we do here is what's a good estimate and what's a bad estimate, and what's a good estimate of look like, and what is a bad estimate. And I think, no specifics necessary, it doesn't matter, but people give us some shit for not just putting a trial ballot together and throwing it out there and saying that they're like, well, what's the point of this?
And not our first rodeo on that in terms of, we had a media partner for a long time, and there were some people at our media partner that, just really had to, pushed us every time to do the trial ballots as soon as we could. Yeah,
and I'll just say, look, I'm an expert in this. And I don't know what I would make if I saw a trial ballot. Let's just say we have a bunch of two-way trial ballots. We've got John Cornyn against Ken Paxton. We've got Ken Paxton against Wesley Hunt. We've got John Cornyn against Wesley Hunt. Let's throw them all in together. And by the way, there might be 3 or 4 other people that I don't even know. One of them might have a middle name Secession. Who knows? We just don't know yet. We don't know if there's 6 candidates in. We don't know if there's other high-quality candidates. We don't know if someone like Ronnie Jackson wants to get in. We don't know if there's some conservative social media personality who's going to decide to use their 2 million followers and jump in the race. We just don't know that. So when I get an estimate that says, hey, John Cornyn's closing the gap with Ken Paxton in a one-on-one head-to-head matchup, it's like, that's a matchup that's probably not going to happen. So what is that an estimate? Now, I'm setting aside other conversations we've had in here over and over about the fact that I don't know what the Republican primary electorate is going to look like yet. So you're basically sort of, both making up an electorate that doesn't exist, again, and this is where the attention really matters, by the way, because ultimately who's going to ultimately vote and, make it through a likely voter screen in a survey is going to be a reflection to some extent of attention and engagement and interest, which honestly voters are not registering yet.
Right.
So,
and look, some of our, private consultants would be saying, well, the way you do that is you use the voter file. And, and there are ways that you can hone that down more or less. And I think, but those problems are still causing uncertainty in the estimates.
And you know what I would say about that? I'd say
context and
I would say you're absolutely right.
Composition of the electorate.
But the way that those consultants is going to use that data is they're going to say, okay, well, we've got where are our biggest gaps? What do they look like? Where are we running strong? How does that inform our strategy so that we can change the nature of those estimates?
And if it's convenient, do we need to release some of this to get a reporter to write a story?
Right. And ultimately that helps with strategy, but the estimate itself is totally meaningless. It's totally meaningless. It's just saying, hey, I'm going to give you 2 choices. You're not going to face these 2 choices in the booth.
Well, it's meaningless in terms of figuring out like what.
Well, it's meaningless in terms of the estimate. It's meaningless as a representation of the thing that it's proposing, that it's estimating, which is what the actual outcome in an election is going to look like. Because again, it's not actually a reflection of the ballot. Right. It's not a reflection of how many tens of millions of dollars Cornyn still has to spend, however many tens of millions of dollars Ken Paxton and his allies are going to spend. And here's the big thing for me. I'm just going to throw this out there, and I don't know if this is something that other people have pointed out, probably, so I'll say this. But, like, what our data shows, and we do favorability ratings. Just to jump back. Let me jump here.
Let's get to
so
the
what we
thing.
do is, we ask favorability ratings. You have a favorable or unfavorable view of each of these people. We also obviously ask job approval numbers for the people who are in office. So Cornyn has a job approval rating. Paxton has a job approval rating. We put them on the favorability scale so we can put everybody on the same scale.
Right.
First and foremost. We also have a pretty long time trend so we can see changes in time over, where these are. So for example, if Cornyn is weak among the most conservative voters, is that moving at all over time? We can look at that, right? And ultimately, what this data uncovers, which we keep saying uncovers, is, look, John Cornyn has some greater weaknesses among Republican voters than some of these other candidates, although they all have some weaknesses. So when we look at the favorability ratings for John Cornyn among Republicans, 42 have a favorable view, 25 have an unfavorable view. That number in and of itself, it's a little bit higher amongst the most conservative voters, or among conservatives. Yep. I think it's 28. But that number right there, that is the rationale. Both, in a lot of ways for a lot of people. That's the
problem.
That's the problem,
quote unquote.
That's the problem that other candidates are trying to exploit. Now, the issue I think for these other candidates and everyone who's sort of looking at these head-to-head matchups is, I'll ask you this question. Let's do this as rhetorical. Do I think John Cornyn's chances against Ken Paxton would improve if Wesley Hunt gets in the race?
Right, and one thinks no.
Well, I mean,
possibly, but
here's.
The question is, does Hunt present himself as a clear alternative, or does he just take votes from Paxton?
Well, and that's the question, and I think the issue here is that Cornyn's weakness is that there are some of the most conservative voters who we tend to think dominate the Republican primaries have reticence about some of his positions, his style, whatever. My suspicion would be that most of the candidates who would get into the race are looking to exploit that weakness and are going to try to get to the right of Cornyn. Right. If it's just Ken Paxton, look, I think Ken Paxton probably beats John Cornyn. I mean, on average, I think that's a good bet to make. If it's Ken Paxton and another conservative alternative, they're technically going to be looking for the same voters. Now, I'm not saying that pushes John Cornyn over 50%. It maybe makes...
Well, that's kind of the rationale. The rationale, the messaging that I saw from the Hunt supporters in the newsletters and stuff this morning, as I digested it, was kind of twofold, which is kind of what you're saying. Paxton, right idea, wrong guy.
Yeah, which is fair because Paxton,
which is a fair thing, but also that and this is where it's a little more contentious, I think, but interesting and Cornyn is so weak that if you have two conservatives in the race, or two people on the far conservative end, that actually it becomes Hunt and Paxton in the runoff, which is maybe.
Maybe. I mean, I think
kind of that's where do campaigns matter?
Yeah, that is true. But I think it is interesting that when you look at the overall favorability numbers, 45% of the electorate has an unfavorable view of Cornyn, 45% has an unfavorable view of Paxton, and no more than 28% has a favorable view of either of them.
Right. And the Hunt numbers, as of now, were 22 favorable, 10 unfavorable, and 67 no opinion among Republicans.
So. Right. So, I mean, this is all to say, I think that this kind of data in some ways does the same thing that the campaign pollsters. You can say, hey, I mean, what I'm looking at is the same thing. People are saying, John Cornyn is going out there and starting to prosecute the case against Ken Paxton. Do we see any movement in the numbers that would indicate that? Not really.
Yeah, and just there wasn't much movement in the Cornyn Paxton numbers between June and August. Right?
No, so even
which is interesting. I mean, there was a little bit, but nothing to really hang anything on statistically for sure. And that is interesting after a summer of it kind of makes a couple points, right?
Yeah.
One, after a summer of everybody in the political world, paying attention to this and being really interested in it and, wanting to run trial ballots in the summer and this kind of thing, that hasn't moved very much.
Well, and this goes back to the whole, I just would say that, this goes back to the trial ballot thing, and why I think this has more value because it doesn't add in the noise of a head-to-head matchup that's not really meaningful. We take them all on their own. We compare where voters come down on these different people. And again, I pointed out that if depending on who's in the race, if Wesley Hunt is in the race, if a Ronnie Jackson jumped in, if some conservative blogger jumps in, we would expect a different configuration of the voting patterns, right? But here's the other big piece of this, and I think this is the other thing that is sort of floating above all of this is right now this is a race for Donald Trump's endorsement, and I think if you're sitting here watching this and saying that doesn't matter in this primary,
to either get it or keep him off the field.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I mean, I think if you're watching this and you think that doesn't matter, you're crazy. And the other piece of this is why for someone like Cornyn, the more people you can get in this race, I think the better, because one, they're probably mostly going to be fighting with Paxton for voters in most cases. I think that's where the weakness is. But two, you make it a tougher proposition for Trump, because Trump doesn't want to, give an endorsement to someone who's not going to win. His job is to be the kingmaker. If it looks at all like it's not clear, he might just stay out. But again, this kind of speaks to the point again about what the value of a trial ballot is in August, because we don't know who is going to be there. We don't know what Trump's going to do, and those things do matter dramatically.
To summarize in a more less focused on the comparison approach. I mean, I think our approach has been this is a good direct estimate of where a potential candidate stands.
Yeah.
It's kind of that easy.
Yeah.
And, it's not, it may be a little bit more work to kind of think this through than to just have a trial ballot with everybody on it. But it's a better estimate. And, this is also why we've been, I would say we've been pretty conservative and conservative is maybe not the right word. Tentative, because it is early and there is always competition for real estate in who we've included in this too.
Yeah.
I mean, that list, this list always starts out very long with everybody that could be on it. Maybe, this list was very long when we started, but at the end, as you start thinking about what else we have to do with the poll and what else is going on out there, and critically where we are in the cycle, this is not meant to be representative. These are kind of heat checks.
Yeah, let's
talk about the Democrats.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, let's end on Tallarico maybe, because we had asked about him before he announced, but there had been a lot of attention to him specifically because of his appearance on Joe Rogan, and that really generated a bunch of attention. And so, he goes to jump in the race. Now, have we included him in a trial ballot against Colin Allred? No. But you know what we know from this? 60% of Democratic voters have no idea who this guy is right now, which is, actually pretty good in and of itself.
Yeah, and the ones that know like him.
Yeah, the ones that know like him. But, which we find is, similar to Hunt, most voters do not know who this person is. So to sort of say, like, well, let's throw him in a trial ballot and see what happens, it's like, well, okay. I mean, we could.
Yeah.
But ultimately, you're asking people to make a decision based on someone they don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were considering putting him on in June even, and then kind of said it was just too early, and it's, it just hadn't ripened in a way, and, we could have, and it wouldn't have hurt anything.
Well, it's tricky. I mean, it's tricky right now because I think, while it's clear still sort of, who the Republican power players are and sort of who wants to move up and that kind of, that's like been, being broadcast kind of for a while now. The Democratic side is just a lot less formed at this point. It's really a lot less clear who exactly is kind of leading things. I mean, it's interesting, Allred jumped in immediately, and it's pretty clear that like that has done nothing to sort of dissuade, anybody who's considering it at least.
Right.
And so, that's kind of why. I think we also included Jasmine Crockett on this poll because she had generated a ton of attention, and she again did very well among Democratic voters.
Yeah, I would say this is one of the more, not shocking in any way, but kind of raised my eyebrows when I saw her unfaves among Democrats. I mean, at 61 favorable, 7 among Democrats. I mean, that's a pretty big number for a member of Congress who moved from the state legislature, having not been there particularly long, and then moved into Congress. I mean, it's an interesting finding.
Well, look at it this way. I mean, just to put that in context.
Put it all. Yeah.
Well, let me just put this in context. I don't even care about anything else. But Colin Allred is at 63-12 among Democrats, and Jasmine Crockett is 61-7.
Yeah.
So I mean, you've got someone who's run statewide, spent $80 million plus doing it recently.
Right.
And she basically went to Congress and got on MSNBC a lot and has just, basically caught up.
Yeah, and just to kind of fill out what we asked about. And then Beto O'Rourke, who I don't expect to run for that race, but there was a lot of talk that, just gossip, that decision was kind of contingent on who else got in addition to Allred. That there had been a lot of, discussions among people. But, O'Rourke was at 73-10 among Democrats, but also, ran basically the highest net negative among the overall sample because, he's pretty known quantity. I mean, most people that pay even halfway attention, the guys run statewide in one way or the other, been on a statewide ballot 3 times in the state. Yeah. He's at 37-44 among all Texas voters.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I'm really, as curious as I am about the Republican ballot, I'm probably just as curious, if not more so, to see like how the Democrats sort themselves out. I mean, is anyone going to take on Abbott? Like, and I've heard some names floating around recently that
yes.
I think you probably heard, based on your face, I feel like you probably heard the same ones.
Well, look, we have to be coy about it. I mean, I think Brad Johnson at the Texan has been checking domain registrations, and I think he, with understandable kind of glee, went aha and pointed out that State Rep Gina Hinojosa had registered a domain. So we're not trying to be too cagey here.
Yeah.
And again, that is pure social media data bit and gossip. So
yeah.
But
but that's all. But
there is a factual thing there.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think there's a bigger look, and the fact is that it's just, we're getting to the end, but it is interesting when you take all this together, right?
Yeah.
And you look at sort of it's not surprising why there are so many Democrats who are interested in this Senate race. They're interested in the Senate race because if Ken Paxton is the nominee, there's a lot of things they can talk about his record, about his ethics, about his history that are just there.
Right.
And there'll be things that John Cornyn has probably
It seem not to be moving Republicans especially, but maybe more likely to move general election voters.
Move
with
independent.
weak attachments or that are infrequent voters or something.
Yeah, and the things, and honestly, they will probably be able to use, pieces of ads cut by John Cornyn and spent, with a lot of money, to sort of make the same point. And that's going to be something that I think they will do gleefully.
It's a nice cost saver.
It's a cost saver. Yeah. And it'll, and so there's that. But also you look at these broader numbers and you're like, yeah, okay. So Trump's, majority disapproval, majority thinking the economy's in the wrong, not doing well.
Yeah.
Majority thinks the Texas economy not doing well. The personal economy not doing well. Worried about the future. Say Texas is on the wrong track. Majority or plurality, disagree with the Texas model of government. On and on and on. And, you can barely hear crickets about who is like running against Greg Abbott. Now, look, I understand why.
Right.
That's not a fun job. And especially with all that he has at his disposal. But I got to say, as much as Democrats, should be looking at 2026 as a potential opportunity with Republicans at the White House and potential economic concerns, if nobody runs, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And honestly, if Abbott just has, upwards of $80 million to spend on a general election campaign, that's really probably not going to matter.
Yeah, no, it's a, we've bumped against the structural disadvantages that the Texas Democrats are facing right now and a few times in this conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, good convo. You got office hours coming up.
Yes, I do.
So, you need to provide a high level of service to the kids.
Always.
So thanks for being here. Thanks for waiting.
My pleasure.
With that, all the results we've talked about, as always, and more at the texaspoliticsproject.utexas.edu. If you're listening to this on a podcasting platform or YouTube, first, thank you. And I hear the podcasters say this, and it makes me feel awkward. But I guess I'm supposed to, hit the like button or something. I guess.
Yeah, do it.
And
do it.
Which that made my stomach hurt a little bit just to do that. But not that I'm beyond pandering.
He
says
that, but honestly, now he's going to go check and see if the numbers change.
Damn well better do it. No. So if you're listening on a podcast platform, if you go to our website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu, there'll be a post with a player, and also, we'll put some of these results as a teaser in there. And there's a great search engine at our website that you can use to find these results more, download, lots and lots of files of these graphics that you can drop into PowerPoints, mailers, used for teaching.
You can download the underlying data
parties,
and put it in your own format.
Print posters. Yeah, exactly. And plus the data. So with that, thanks again, as always, to our excellent production team in the Liberal Arts Development Studio / audio department here at UT Austin. Thanks to you all for listening, and we'll be back as soon as we can with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.